All right, thank you for your patience. Good evening and welcome to Cabinet. I'm Sina Najafi, Editor-in-Chief of Cabinet, and I'm very, very happy, despite my cold, that you could join us for tonight's event on the Venice Biennial. Our three panelists need no introduction, but in a few minutes I'll be handing over to my colleague Burnett, who will be moderating the panel, who will redundantly, needlessly introduce them and get the ball rolling. Before I hand over, I wanted to say a few words about tonight's event. Those of you who know me know that me wearing a shirt and one that's semi-ironed is a very odd and special event. And the reason why I'm wearing the shirt is because tonight's event is special and odd. It's special because of who we have here. It's odd because after 200 plus panels, talks, symposia cabinet involving dozens of artists, curators, art historians, we've never had an event about a specific contemporary art exhibition. Now the Venice Biennial is no ordinary contemporary art exhibition, but nevertheless this is the first one we've done in 13 years. Those of you who are fans of very, very long emails, the ones that Cabinet specializes in, will note that in section 18 of the one we sent you, provided tonight, we hinted as to why this is happening here. Namely that at Massimiliano's invitation, Cabinet was invited to commission and edit the 24 essays that accompany the catalogue for the Encyclopedic Palace. There's a copy of it somewhere. Great. There we go. And the copy just became available in this country, which was the impetus in some sense to do this event as well. Massimiliano's invite came by email on November 13th, about 2 weeks after Hurricane Sandy brought roughly 7 feet of toxic water from the nearby Gowanus Canal into this building, and it flooded our basement. It killed the electricity, the heat, and all the water in this building. So when Massimiliano's email came, we actually bought a very cheap generator for $599. It was sitting in this room, and we had 2 computers and I think 3 lights lighting us, trying to do our work. It was very, very cold. And we talked to Massimiliano very briefly, my colleague Jeff Castor and I, and despite the fact that the concerns of the show seemed so much to echo our own project and raise some of the same questions we're interested in, we actually said no. Massimiliano then asked us to reconsider. Not in an Italian way, but he asked us to think again. We met with him in early December, and he laid out for us the vision of the show, and we decided that this was a perfect opportunity for us to get involved, and we said yes. So, Massimiliano, thank you very much for the invitation twice. Once for inviting us, and once for re-inviting us. It was great to be part of the project. As I said, the basic concerns of the show, especially the relationship between knowledge, the will to knowledge, and aesthetics that the show raises, are things that we ourselves have at times been very interested in, have done certain projects around. And in fact, we had just finished thinking about the encyclopedic impulse because we put together an anthology called Curiosity and Method, which is an encyclopedia that had come out a month or so before Massimiliano's invite came. What is in the catalogue? Boris Boyce writes that catalogue essays are written in order not to be read. So I'm going to assume none of you will ever read the catalogue. It's more likely you'll save your money, go all the way to Venice than to look at the catalogue. But the catalogue tries to track in some ways. As a group, they examine the larger history of the modern will to knowledge by looking at fragments from that history. It goes back in time more than the exhibition does. I think the oldest thing in the exhibition, correct me if I'm wrong, is the Shaker drawings. Is that right? But the catalog goes all the way back to the early modern period, and also touches on many topics that don't produce visual artifacts that in that sense cannot have been part of the exhibition. I'll mention a few of the many topics addressed in the catalog in the 24 essays. Giulio Camillo's 16th century memory theater, which was spatially organized all of knowledge for a spectator who could walk into it. Pre-18th century encyclopedias before the familiar ones of the Enlightenment solidified the genre into what we recognize today. Dream knowledge and the kinds of knowledges we can glean from dreams. And in fact, the dream of Michael Harris, a mathematician, is analyzed by Marina Warner in her text. And I'm very happy that Michael Harris is with us tonight. He's the first dreamer to be here in our space. Philip K. Dick's famous Golden Fish episode, in which he thought that all of knowledge had suddenly become available to him. Other essays are The Collecting Impulse and the Neurotics of Collecting and How It Goes Mad. The NSA, the US government's deep, deep desire to know and record all forms of communication. Prophesying the future and the dream of knowing the future. The 19th century utopian schemes for perfectly ordered societies and the way in which they mobilize certain ideas of knowledge. Paperwork and the ways in which paperwork always necessarily frustrates the state's will to know. And invented languages designed to grasp the world better than the organic ones can. There are many other things. This is just a list to give you a sense of the wide range of topics that are discussed in the essays. This sounds immensely broad, and it is, but there is a framing device that hopefully brings the essays a little closer to one another and hopefully puts them in dialogue with each other. The starting point for the catalog in our discussions with the writers was a story, probably apocryphal, concerning Hegel, which goes like this. After one of his lectures, a student of Hegel's approached him and told him about a particular flower in Patagonia, whose development, the student claimed, somehow did not fit into Hegel's system of things rising from the east and coming to the New World in a particular way. And having listened to him, Hegel apparently said, "Too bad for that flower in Patagonia," and stormed off. So in some sense, what we wanted to do, what we asked the writers to do, was to think not only about the remainders and surpluses, the flowers in Patagonia and elsewhere, that resisted being incorporated into them, to think about those things as well as the totalizing systems of knowledge, and to think about what can be eaten or digested by such systems. One of my favorite moments in the catalog comes from Will West's essay on the early modern encyclopedia and concerns, it's a great name, Joachim Sturck von Ringelbergi's Encyclopedia of 1541, a very early one. And this encyclopedia was honest in a way that later encyclopedias could not imagine being. It concluded with a section called Chaos. And there, Ringelberg put all the things for which you could not find a good place in the encyclopedia proper. So, on that note, I'll hand over to Graham, who will initiate the panel. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. Sina's already pointed out that introductions to the panelists this evening are superfluous. Nevertheless, I'll go ahead and perform the pleonastic exercise in order of our presentations. Massimiliano Gioni is Associate Director of the New Museum and Artistic Director of the Niccolò Trussardi Foundation in Milan, and he was the Director of the 55th Venice Biennial. Speaking after Massimiliano, we have Lynne Cooke, Andrew W. Mellon Professor at the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., curator of numerous shows, and currently working on an exhibition that will explore the shifting interface between mainstream and self-taught artists in the United States in the 20th century. And that, I think, will be one of the themes we'll be talking about this evening a little bit. And then my colleague and dear friend at Princeton, Hal Foster, who teaches art history and theory at Princeton University, a distinguished and brilliant critic. Latest book is Junk Space with Running Room, authored in conjunction with Rem Koolhaas. So what we'll do is we'll have each of our panelists speak for 8 to 10 minutes, and then we'll have some discussion up here, which I'll, not that these folks need facilitating when it comes time to talk about their subject matter, but I'll attempt to keep that warm, and then we'll turn things over to you all for an open conversation. So without further ado, Massimiliano.
Thank you, Graham. First of all, I do want to thank, we haven't had a chance to talk about the Biennale yet in New York, actually. So it's a very nice occasion also to thank many of the people that worked with me. I think my accent immediately betrays the reason why I asked for help from Cabinet and from Sina and Jeff. They are much more eloquent than I am, and I think it was a great collaboration. And so I'm very thankful to both of you and to all the authors in the catalog and to Cabinet, because it was really a great collaboration and a great inspiration. As the title of this Biennale, the Encyclopedic Palace, suggests, I'm not very capable of great synthesis, and I think Cabinet was a great collaborator because he brought focus on a series of thematics which were at the same time precise and open enough to reflect one of the tensions that drive through the exhibition, and maybe I'll talk about it in a second. I also have to thank the members of the team that work with me very closely, and they happen to be here: Natalie Bell, Helga Christofferson, and Chris Wiley, and there were many other people, but the three of them were really the conspirators of this Biennale, and I really thank them because they made it possible. I'll just try to present a few directions or a few lines of thoughts that go through the exhibition. What you see behind me, and the images, bear in mind, after showing you these first images, the images I'll show you are in random order, which is not exactly how I would like to show it, but I was too late, and so we just dumped them on the computer. The whole show is actually based on a quite rigid choreography, so it's a bit of a pity that you see it in random order tonight. But anyway, the first image here is the Encyclopedic Palace, which gives the title to the entire exhibition. It's a strange object which on many levels encapsulates many of the problems and thoughts that animate the exhibition. First of all, I'm not even sure if it is an artwork or not. It's an object that was realized by a man whose name was Marino Auriti. He was an Italian-American who left Italy during fascism and moved to Pennsylvania, where he was a car mechanic, and he started building this object, which eventually he patented because he was so convinced of the extraordinary quality of its decoration design. It's an object that is built with scrap material, with plastic combs to create the balconies, and it's a palace in which Auriti dreamt of containing all the knowledge of the world, as he said, from the wheel to the satellite. It was meant to be 136 floors tall, and it would have occupied 16 blocks of the city of Washington. This object, I thought, perfectly encapsulated not only in its complicated status, because as I said, I'm not sure even if it's an artwork or not, but also in its narrative and in the intention of the artist. He encapsulated what I think is the main theme of the exhibition, and that is the impossible desire to see and know everything. One of the quotations that led me through this adventure, and I would discover it was actually an apocryph quotation from Plato that Athanasius Kirchner put at the entrance of the museum of the Compagnia de Gesù, of the Jesuits, say nothing is sweeter than knowing everything. And I think that's a sentence that many of the individuals in this exhibition would identify with. I was curious to look at this desire for knowledge and the way in which it relates to our present. So on many levels, I thought that this show is a sort of prehistory of Wikipedia, or it looks at the ways in which this desire for knowledge that characterize our present culture, with this obsession with information, with transparency, with hypervisibility, and secrets, in a way, cast its roots much further back. It is definitely not a show about the Encyclopédie or about the Enlightenment. On many levels, it's the furthest example that I could think of. On the other hand, as Sina was speaking, I thought that it's interesting to remind ourselves that the Encyclopédie was written when there was no electricity, so maybe Sandy helped us concentrate a little more. So it's not a show about the Encyclopédie, but it's a show about flights of fantasy and what I call deliriums of the imagination. The word image and imagination are actually crucial in the exhibition. I thought particularly the show was about knowledge and how knowledge is structured and organized through images, and that's, for example, why the reference to Giulio Camillo and the theaters of memories was very important even for the architecture of the exhibition. I also thought, as I was planning the Biennale, and as I always do when I work on these large-scale shows, that I wanted to ask myself how this particular edition of the Biennale set in the history of the Venice Biennale and in the history of the format of biennial exhibitions. Venice, it's a very peculiar place because the Venice Biennale is also a peculiar institution because it's the exhibition of contemporary art, the oldest exhibition of contemporary art, and it's the one that in a way is the closest to the model of the international exhibition, the most famous being the 1851 in London. So it's a place in which the myth of the universal has been created and cultivated. And so as I was asked to make a show at the Venice Biennale, I started asking myself, what is this desire of knowledge that is also encapsulated in the Biennale itself. When you are nominated director, there's immediately this expectation that you are the man who knows everything about contemporary art and that you have to travel everywhere to see the world. And so there is an expectation of universalism in which I was uncomfortable and that I thought the exhibition could look at and at the same time question and reflect. So that was one of the thoughts that led me to the development of the exhibition. The second thought in relation to the format and the history of biennials was that I was frankly really tired of the sort of 1990s model of biennials as a free-for-all, as a place where artists are invited to create new works, and the bigger the better, and in a state of, they reduce the viewer in a state of sort of narcotic stupor. I was also a bit tired of another experience that's become more and more common in exhibition making or in the consumption of artworks, and that is the experience of the fair and the experience of the new as a sort of contemporary dictatorship. And it's ironic because I work at a new museum, but this idea that the new is good by definition, and I was a bit bored with that idea. And I was also particularly tired of how these ideas were becoming complicit with a very specific market. And I don't want to sound moralistic, but I wanted the biennial to sort of draw a line on those models. Also, if you look at the history of the Venice Biennale, it's quite interesting because what we associate today with the biennial is a very recent history that dates more or less to the 90s. If you look at the history of biennials in the 70s or even earlier, they were much more carefully constructed thematic shows, and they were maybe less preoccupied with the industry of the new and more, let's say, in the organization of ideas. So I thought of a show that would look less like a biennial and more as a temporary museum, or that's how I define it, or as I thought of an exhibition which in its own choreography could also reflect on different museological structures. So within the show, as you visit it, you're sort of led through different examples of display, from the Kunstkammer, from the Cabinet of Curiosities to the, let's say, modern museum. It's also another element that characterizes this exhibition is the fact that, as I said, it's not flattened on the present, but it sort of spans 100 years of history. The oldest works are the Shaker drawings, but I thought the centerpiece or the starting piece was Carl Gustav Jung's Red Book, which is presented in the first room of the Central Pavilion, which dates from 1913, and it's a strange object on which Jung worked for more than 16 years of his life. So the idea of either synchronicity or anachronism was very crucial for the exhibition, and to break away from the flattening of the eternal present that I see developed in other museums. Another, I think, element of novelty, or anyway difference from previous biennials, was the prominence of artists or individuals who were not trained as artists, who, I say, trafficked in images throughout their life without even asking themselves the question of whether they were artists or not. So in the exhibitions there are artists who are traditionally considered outsider artists. There are people who made images like Jung without ever thinking of themselves as artists. There are intellectual writers who collected images rather than making images themselves. For me, I mean, this was in a way the culmination of a research that has been happening in various places, but it was also much influenced by coming across a great little book by Hans Belting, whose writing had influenced another show of mine, the Gwangju Biennale in South Korea. And in this little book called The Anthropology of Images, Hans Belting makes a case for a sort of post-history of art in which there is no distinction between art and non-art, and in which we look at images on a sort of, anticipating the title of your contribution, on a sort of even field. I also start thinking of many interpreters and art historians that I was very much interested in, and from Roland Barthes to Régis Debray, Umberto Eco, even Marshall McLuhan at the beginning. So many art historians or thinkers had looked at image making and image production and image consumption, moving beyond the distinction between art and non-art. And so I thought that it was time even for a biennial to move away from that distinction. So one of the provocations of this biennale is that he almost doesn't care about art and non-art. And I will say something, and I might be stoned by any artist in the room. He doesn't care about good art or bad art. He looks at artworks as, to use a very problematic term, as symptoms, not of a disease, but symptoms of an attitude towards the world. I think he looks at images and artworks as expressions of a vision of the world, and not as an artwork as a, I was a bit unhappy also of the sort of agonistic vision of contemporary art, in which biennials become a place where you show the 100 best artists of the world, and I wanted in that sense to knock certain masterworks from the pedestal and see what happens, and can we look at them again for what I think they are, and that is simply visions of the world, or ways to experience and organize the world. I'll end in 1 second by saying that another very important idea which leads the whole exhibition, and which again I stole or borrowed from Hans Belting, it was a very simple and mind-blowing idea that he explains in Anthropology of Images. He says the human is the only animal who makes images, and for a long time in philosophy we have thought of language being the sort of differentiating factor between humans and animals, and he says it's not so simple. It's image making which distinguish humans, and he goes on to say that the body itself is the primary locus of image, the primary medium of images, and that I think sort of led a lot of the thrust of the exhibition in a continuous confrontation between the image as a tool with which we get to know the world and organize the world, and the image as we carry inside in our bodies and in our minds. And on many levels the exhibition is about this continuous dialogue between the inside and the outside, and between making things visible through images. And I think that's all as an introduction.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I'll go right to Professor Cooke.
By thanking Sina and Cabinet Large for this invitation to talk about the show. It's given, the exhibition has prompted a lot of thought for me, and having an opportunity to engage in a debate is great. In the 90s we saw a geographical expansion of the borders of the contemporary art world, and I think more recently we're seeing others of its margins being broken open. Massimiliano's exhibition, the Encyclopedic Palace, has been acclaimed not only for its inclusion of a significant number of self-taught artists, but above all for the even-handed presentation of their work. One of modernism's many others, the self-taught, folk, naive visionary of vernacular or outsider, and I'm lumping them all together for the moment, has become the focus of much current study. Setting aside the endlessly problematic term warfare that routinely encompasses the discussion of most of what is classified under these monikers, I want to look at the question of what it means to present this work on an even playing field, that is, to put mainstream artists and self-taught artists together. And the playing field, as I see it, is the white cube gallery with the standard simple labels with the name of the artwork, the date, the media, the owner, but no large biographical introduction to the outsider, folk, whatever. No didactics, no ancillary material, just a very even-handed presentation. And this leads to a second question. If we can do this, do we need these classifications of folk, psychotic, and so forth? That is, we saw in the 90s, I think, when a select number of folk or outsider artists, the very preeminent, so to speak, like Bill Traylor or Martin Ramirez, were poached from that world and inserted into the contemporary art world on the basis, it was argued, that stylistically and formally their work was so innovative and so radical, they transcended the classifications and could be seen under the honorific of artist. More recently, I think we've got a broader call to dissolve the categories altogether. And there are a number of reasons for this. One would be, most perhaps pragmatic, is that very often visually it's simply very hard to distinguish between objects made by schooled and unschooled makers. And then, of course, there are many theoretical questions. I'll get to this in a minute. When in the early 1920s, American modernists like Charles Shearer, Marston Hartley enthused over 19th century folk art, they were looking at utilitarian artifacts, store signs, weather vanes, decoy ducks, shaker furniture, and limmer portraits. And they admired them for their pictorial and sculptural properties, finding in those artifacts a kinship with their own work. In relating to the simplified design and the skilled craftsmanship of these objects, they paid scant attention to the object's historical significance, their decorative qualities, and they were not at all interested in such notions as quaintness. When shortly after Alfred Barr, the Museum of Modern Art, responded to material of this kind, he embraced it not only on account of its formal properties, but genealogically, so to speak. That is, he saw it as the wellspring from which a uniquely modern American avant-garde might emerge. And so consequently, in collection displays, and you see an example from 1945, and in exhibitions that trace the history of modern art, which the Museum of Modern Art toured in this country and abroad, he would start the exhibitions with examples of folk art, which he saw as a point of departure in an unfolding narrative and which he treated on an even playing field. What you see here is a decoy fish and a sculpture that was in Abbey Rockefeller's collection, which was thought to be a carving of Harriet Beecher Stowe, I think. These are 19th century artifacts, and then the painting is by Joseph, I'm blanking, of Manchester Valley, Joseph Pickett, which, and Pickett was shown not in exhibitions of classic folk art, but under the rubric of popular painter, and the popular painters, these self-taught artists, were seen as the living embodiment of folk artists, if you like. But when we look at the presentation of folk art in exhibitions today, and I'm thinking to take one case from Massimiliano's show of Levi Fisher Ames, I think the situation is very different. Levi Fisher Ames made these fantastic animals and farm animals and put them into boxes and took them on touring tent shows in the Northwest and presented them to the accompaniment of music and narrative, voiceover tales. When we look at the kinds of 19th century work that is being selected now, it tends to be the work of the maverick and the eccentric. And it's work by named authors who have bodies of identifiable objects, oeuvre, in other words. And for whom we would be likely to use terms like quaintness or eccentricity. In other words, the kinds of folk art that is now being appreciated from the past is diametrically opposite to that I think Schiller and Hartley and that generation were interested in. So the question becomes, what does it mean to bring this work into a playing field and to put it in the vicinity, for example, of the work of Richard Serra and Tacita Dean, as we saw in Venice? What gets lost in this? What does the shift in terminology mean to an understanding of the historicity of ideas? And I would then ask if the situation is different if we look not at classic folk art from the 18th and 19th centuries, but to something more contemporary, to the work of outsider artists like Lee Gotti, Morton Bartlett, and Judith Scott. And you see here two pieces by Morton Bartlett, who made some 15 of these dolls very privately during his lifetime and photographed them with many different costumes, and then boxed them carefully and packed them away, and they remained in his apartment to be found only after his death. If you think about these and the work of Lee Gotti, who is essentially a street person who made work either by going to bus stations and using photomat booths or making drawings. An example you see on the right-hand side. And these works she sold to people she liked, but not to everyone, and she sold them mostly in an area around the Art Institute of Chicago, where she was daily for many years. I think it's possible, and we've seen it very recently, to contextualize this work, Gotti's or Bartlett's, along with contemporary artists like Laurie Simmons or Cindy Sherman or Mike Kelly, and to treat their work in exactly the same way, without recourse to the kind of biographical framing that's typical of the presentation of outsider artists or folk artists in specialized institutions like museums of folk art and the like. The question is, of course, with Gotti and Bartlett, we can hypothesize something about their intentions from what we know from witness accounts, from people around them, about their lives, what they might have intended by the making of these works, and therefore test that if intentions are indeed relevant when placing it in conjunction with works by Cindy Sherman and so forth. In the case of Judith Scott, we can't. We really know nothing about what she intended by making these objects. Scott's work, for those of you who don't know it, is these are typical examples in that she works mainly with wool and yarn and wraps objects to the point where you don't see what the interiors are, and it takes some abstract form. We know nothing about really what she intended by them, nor about what they meant to her while she was doing it. But I think it's possible, again, to imagine them in context with works by Rachel Harrison or Rosemary Trockle or Jessica Stockholder, where a discourse can be put around them in which the works function alongside those of the contemporary artists in a way that adds richness or makes these works a compelling part of a dialogue. There's only one book to date published on Scott's work, and its title is Metamorphosis, the Fiber Art of Judith Scott. Its subtitle is An Outsider Artist and the Experience of Down Syndrome. I would argue we could have another book, and it could be called Judah Scott, Sculptor. I want to end by thinking about Phyllis Kind, who was an art gallerist in Chicago in the 1970s, who I think is the first person to have done this, who have had mixed works by Joseph Joachim, Martin Ramirez, Henry Darger, and those of the professional artists she represented, Jim Minott, Gladys Nielsen, Roger Brown, and others. She treated them in the works in an absolutely even-handed, non-hierarchical fashion. And yet, for all of that, Phyllis Kind vehemently argued that it was absolutely essential when looking at the work by self-taught artists not to underestimate the enormity of the difficulty that they faced in getting to the point of making art. I would end by contrasting that perhaps with Forrest Bess, who was self-described as an abstract primitive or a visionary artist. He was a virtual recluse from the art world, and he made his living as a bait fisherman in a remote part of Texas south of Bay City, and he painted when he could. In an undated letter to Maya Shapiro, he wrote, and I'm quoting, "I sense that I have very little to do with what is put down on canvas. The vision is there. The execution of the vision, the visual copying of it, is of very little importance. Yet the damn things have to be painted, otherwise they bother me." Between 1950 and 67, Bess had 5 solo shows at Letty Parsons Gallery in New York, where Rothko and Pollock were then also exhibiting. Parsons steadfastly refused to allow Bess to present material, diagrams and texts in conjunction with his paintings. He believed that this ancillary material was absolutely essential to deciphering the symbols that appeared in his art, and also to explicating his thesis that uniting the male and the female aspects of the self, that would have united the female-male aspects of the self as a key to regeneration and eternal life. It was not until 1981, when the Whitney staged a posthumous retrospective of Bess's work, that these ideas were made public for the first time. How do we square Bess's wishes with the needs of an even playing field? Most of you will have seen the 2012 Whitney Biennial, when Bess's work was presented under the auspices of Robert Gober's contribution to the show, in a space that was a dedicated space exclusively for Bess's work, and was accompanied by texts and diagrams and other didactic material. I would just end by asking, what do we gain, therefore, by treating all these creators as players on the same field? What are the benefits of putting them on an even playing field? Or what do we lose? And what do we lose if we remove the categories which at the moment leave them on the mainstream's margins? Thank you.
Thank you.
So I think my talk follows on Lynne's nicely. I see things a little bit differently. But I too want to congratulate Massimiliano on the show, and Sina and Jeff on the catalog. This is actually Sina, the source is not clear, it might be Jeff at work on the catalog. It's extraordinary that they hand-painted everything. But I do think it's a really good match. I think Sina mentioned that there's a common interest in systems of knowledge, systems of art, and that's in a way what I want to talk about too. And I will touch on the role of the outsider artist as well. But I'm here, I think they would be disappointed if I did not say this, to introduce a note of skepticism And I want to begin with an anecdote that I hope will become relevant as I go along. 30 years or so ago, when we began to talk about postmodern culture, some of us used to speak of it in terms of schizophrenic intensities. And obviously, we're under the influence of Deleuze, Jameson, and others. And a long time ago, I did a talk in California, which I indulged in these terms, or these associations. And a young woman came up to me afterwards, distraught, and said, just directly, you would not talk in this way if you had a brother who was schizophrenic. And ever since, I think I've thought of her as a, my own private superego against my own theoretical romanticism. And I think that there's a trace of this romanticism in the show, and perhaps in the catalog. That's something perhaps we can debate. But Massimiliano mentioned, it's not really fair to quote his own words when he's right here.
I usually quote myself.
Let me do it for you. So this is part of the introduction. He writes, blurring the line between professional artists and amateurs, outsiders and insiders, the exhibition takes an anthropological approach to the study of images, focusing in particular on the realms of the imaginary and the functions of the imagination. The works of these artists help illustrate a condition we all share. We ourselves are media, channeling images, or at times even finding ourselves possessed by images. It's a really provocative idea, I think. But it seems to me that the one idea that governs the show or guides it is this. Again, this is Massimiliano. The idea that images are living, breathing entities, endowed with magical qualities, and capable of influencing, transforming, and even healing. It would take us all night, but I have my doubts about that formulation. Anyway, it's the romance of the visionary outsider that I want to talk about. And this is, in large part, I think, a legacy of modernist art. I just want to sketch this briefly for you, at least as I see it. And I will focus on the art of the insane. Outsider art is a translation, or at least this is one of its origins, of art brut, which is a term developed by Jean Dubuffet. And he wanted to separate outsider art brut from the art of the insane, but he found it very difficult to do so. But I will focus more on the art of the mentally ill. And the key figure here, I should mention that this is Augustin de Sage, who's one of the mediumistic artists that I think Massimiliano does include in the show. So this is Hans Prinzhorn. Many of you will know The Artistry of the Mentally Ill, his famous book. He was an art historian, he was also a psychiatrist at the Heidelberg Psychiatric Clinic for a number of years as that collection of the art of the mentally ill really came to fruition. And this is his text. Now, he argued that 6 drives govern the art of the mentally ill, but also inform all other art. And these are the drives. Drives toward expression, play, ornamental elaboration, pattern order, obsessive copying, and symbolic systems. It just, in this list, I think, there's a contradiction. For his drives toward expression and play imply a subject open to the world in a way that the other drives do not. In fact, compulsive ornamenting, ordering, copying, and system building imply, I think, a subject in rigid, even paranoid defense against the world. And in the end, Prinzhorn did admit this fundamental difference between the artist and the schizophrenic. Here is Prinzhorn. The loneliest artist still remains in contact with humanity, even if only through desire and longing. And the desire for this contact speaks to us out of all pictures by normal people. The schizophrenic, on the other hand, is detached from humanity, and by definition is neither willing nor able to reestablish contact with it. If he would be healed, if he would be healed. We sense in our pictures the complete autistic isolation and the gruesome solipsism that far exceeds the limits of alienation, and believe that in it we have found the essence of schizophrenic configuration. Now, even as Prinzhorn cautioned against an equation between image and psyche, he often assumed it, as he does in this passage. And it is this equation that allowed him to claim in the art of the mentally ill the essential features of artistic configuration as such. Now, I want to submit to you that a similar equation between image and psyche allowed modernists, influenced by Prinzhorn, primarily Paul Klee and Jean Dubuffet, to do much the same thing. This is what I want to unpack quickly right now. Klee identified deeply with the artistry of the mentally ill, and its publication in 1922. He kept a copy of the book in his studio. "You know this excellent work by Prinzhorn," he is said to have remarked once. "This picture is a fine clay, so is this, and this one too. Look at these religious paintings. There's a depth and power of expression that I never achieve in religious subjects. Really sublime art. Direct spiritual vision." But what exactly is this direct spiritual vision that he invokes here? Might it run the risk of a mental state that, far from innocent, and Klee would go on and on about the innocence of vision in such work, the risk of a mental state that is hallucinatory, even horrific, a vision that comes to possess its subject with a sudden enunciation? As we know, Benjamin, who owned this image, the Angelus Novus for a time, saw such a vision in this angel. This state, too direct, too sublime, is evoked in some images in the artistry that are akin to Angelus Novus, such as Monstrous Figure by Johann Knopf, one of the 10 schizophrenic masters, that's how Prinzhorn dubbed them, whose work Klee would have known from the book Artistry of the Mentally Ill. And Prinzhorn gives as his diagnosis a paranoid form of dementia praecox. Now, by the way, as some of you will know, this identification of the modernists with the insane was turned against them soon after by the Nazis, who knew about the Prinzhorn book in the Degenerate Art Show of 1937. And this is actually just a spread that it's a comparison, an art historical comparison between Klee and a piece by an insane person. So another kind of immediacy was projected by Dubuffet, who developed a transgressive model of modernist art based in part on the art of the insane. In 1945, a 3-week tour of psychiatric hospitals in Switzerland prompted him to begin a collection under the rubric of art brut. Again, this was his notion. Brut as in unrefined, uncivilized. In time, it totaled roughly 2,000 works by 63 artists, and it mixed in naive art, the self-taught, the untaught, with the art of the insane. For Dubuffet, the Brut artist is a radical version of the romantic genius free of all conventions. Here's Dubuffet in 1949. We understand by this term Brut works produced by persons unscathed by artistic culture, where mimicry plays little or no part. These artists derive everything, subjects, choice of materials, means of transposition, rhythms, styles of writing, and so on, from their own depths, and not from the conceptions of classical or fashionable art. We are witness here to a completely pure artistic operation, raw, brute, and entirely reinvented in all of its phases, solely by means of the artist's own impulses. It's all Dubuffet, and soon enough he transformed this category of brut into a category of all modernist art. The work of art, he said, is of no interest to me unless it is absolutely immediate and a direct projection of the depths of the individual. Now, this idealization of the art of the insane is similar to that of Prinzhorn and Klee. It too assumes the notions of an essential expression and a direct vision. Yet in addition, for Dubuffet, this art is transgressive. It defines an absolute outside to culture. And yet, far from unscathed by civilization, the psychotic is scarred by trauma. And frequently, this psychic disturbance is registered in the bodily distortions that pervade the art of the mentally ill. For in this art, significant parts of the body, especially eyes and mouths, are often grossly enlarged and sometimes disruptively plunged into other parts of the body, so that eyes become breasts, say, or mouths double as vaginas. In his own work, Dubuffet evokes this schizophrenic self-dislocation, which I want to suggest is far from the completely pure artistic operation that he otherwise projects onto art brut. So here's my main claim. The bodily derangements in this art imply a world that is desperate, even debilitated. And this to me suggests in turn that rather than attack artistic convention in symbolic order, the art of the mentally ill is concerned to find such aesthetic laws again. Indeed, to found a symbolic order again. For to their horror, what these artists, what these subjects, or semi-subjects, post-subjects, seem to see is not a symbolic order that is too stable, that they wish to contest as posited by modernist logic or avant-gardist logic, but rather a symbolic order that is not stable at all, that is in crisis, or at least in corruption. Far from anti-civilizational heroes, as Dubuffet imagines them, these artists are desperate to construct a surrogate civilization of their own. Here we go back to Lesage, who's in the show. A stopgap symbolic order in default of the official one that they perceive to be in ruins. In short, I think that there are the reasons why there's a lot of this work in the 19-teens, 1920s. I think there is a real crisis in the symbolic order at this time, certainly in Europe. But we can talk about that if you want later. Or it could be a whole other day. Anyway, but my point is that I think it was wrong for the modernists to idealize, to aestheticize this work. And I think we were wrong to do so too. The encyclopedia is not only a babble, as Lynne says in her terrific review in Art Form, it might also be a prison house. And I think that's what that young woman 30 years ago meant when she cautioned me about my use of the term, loose use of the term, schizophrenic.
Okay, so we have a great deal on the table, and I think we should begin the conversation by acknowledging the extraordinary success of a show that even 5-10 minutes tipping open a few thoughts immediately brings to the fore such a large number of such deep questions. So I just think that should be noted up front. The question of encyclopedism per se wants to stay with us, it seems to me, for the next 20 minutes or so as we talk up here, as does the question implicit, it again seems to me, in encyclopedism of history and historicity. So before we're done, I'm hoping we'll get to encyclopedism and we'll get to history. But because both these, in a sense, responses from Lynne and Hal have drilled down, isn't quite the right word, but have taken up, maybe we'd say, the status of, and here we're going to have to pick our term, the outsider artist, the self-taught artist, or the stronger and perhaps more troubling category of the psychically aberrational artist. It seems to me we do well to sort of stay there for another moment. And Hal's sort of strong, it's wrong, and you stop me if you think I'm quoting you back with your last point inaccurately. It is wrong for the modernists to have aestheticized or fetishized this work as hero manifestations of sort of romantic, liberal projection of self. That it's wrong. I'd just like to start by asking you to take one more second on the register of that wrong. Is it an ethically wrong, you think? Biomedically wrong? Politically wrong? Just so that we kind of...
Just wrong.
Because of course, you know, I mean, not to be a bad sport with your anecdote, but, you know, I mean, that rather dour young woman who reprimanded you for your moment of late 80s Deleuzian extravagance could be dismissed as just another kind of bourgeois subject with a really tired conception of the normative who had misconstrued her own brother and had failed to appreciate the extent to which he was in direct conversation with the gods. And if she could be helped to see that that was another way of understanding him.
I wish you were there, Graham. You got my friend Graham Burnett.
I mean, you know the move I'm making just as, I mean, you were there and you could have made that move, and yet she got to you in a way, got to you in a way that made you be like, oh, wait.
That's her.
So sorry, that was an Amber Alert.
Okay, now that's an Amber Alert, but probably we're safe. We're good. Good. All right, so we're right someplace where we want to stay, okay? So let's stay right here.
We'll die together.
So how can you just, I don't want to lose a lot of time on this, but do you want a second to say what you mean by wrong? Because that's...
No, I understand that my anecdote was charged, but it did have an effect on me, and it still does. But basically what I wanted to suggest is that how the artists use them, the test is obviously of the work that they do. But I think it's a misconception to think that these artists were transgressive. They were after order. They didn't want to contest one or disrupt one even. And I think that's the that's the fundamental misprision in modernist relations to the art of the insane.
Okay, so
that to me is important because it maybe the modernists suggested that or intuited that these subjects, these artists, were on to a greater crisis too. So it's not a complete misunderstanding, but
so
that's. I meant to be emphatic when I said wrong.
Okay, so I'm gonna
don't fetishize the wrong.
Well, the wrong there is just if you like the good old-fashioned wrong of making an error in that the interpretation of this work as magnificently resistant to a dominant order is itself just an error, like 2 + 2 is 5 is a kind of an error. What you have to have seen in the work is a kind of longing for order and a desire to reestablish order. So let's take that, which is kind of interesting take, recognizing, of course, that in many exercises of transgression, it seems, could be read as having in them a kind of aspiration toward a reestablished order of some other sort, but acknowledging that there's a kind of dialectical way of managing the differentia that have been built. And take the question back to Massimiliano and Lynne. encyclopedism is in some way the leveled playing field. I mean, that's what one of the incredible things that encyclopedism does is, through its logic of collation and juxtaposition, forces questions of taxonomy to the fore, because now we've got all this stuff under one roof, and are we okay with it all just in a pile in the middle of the floor? If not, how are we gonna sort it? So encyclopedism can be understood to bring us that question of the leveled field. I wonder if maybe, Lynne, you would comment just on that proposition, that encyclopedism per se forces to the fore a certain kind of leveling logic.
It does on the one hand, perhaps, in that everything is subject to being put into these taxonomies, but it seems to me that the taxonomies are then in turn ordered again. So you have another system that superimposed on the taxonomy. So if you think of ordering all the things in a museum, they get ordered by date or maker or medium or whatever. But we tend to put them, if they're paintings, into categories that are determined by geography and date. And then we have another system of ordering whereby we put those categories in relation to each other. So it's not an either or, it's a set of series of decision-making around taxonomies, I think.
You began by saying that you were open to the idea of thinking of artworks as symptomatic. It was a term you used. Here we are at this point with questions being asked about what kinds of symptoms.
Well, there are so many questions raised that I don't even know where to begin. First point, I'd rather be a romantic than a cynic, and I'm not saying you are one, but I think I'm not saying at all, but I'd rather be.
Okay,
it might be because I'm Italian and now I'm going to enter into a parody, but I think we do need a certain injection of romanticism, or let's say with a complicated term, or the sort of new myths to escape from what I see the way in which art is treated in many places. So that was for me also part of what this show was about, was let's look elsewhere. The friend Breton said existence is elsewhere. Let's look elsewhere to clean our eyes and minds from what I see is quite a disgusting spectacle that happens elsewhere. And that is romantic, and I'm fine with it. The second question, which I think connects with this romance, of which I think the exhibition is also a reflection on, is the romance between the avant-garde and, let's say, the dilettante, which runs through the surrealists, runs through Dufay and so on. I understand what you're saying about them being wrong, appropriating or misreading the position of the mentally ill, but thank God they did misread that, because he opened up the field, the playing field to many other exciting games. You know, when you start looking at the avant-garde, to think of what wrong or right is dangerous. I mean, Breton says the most surrealist gesture is to shoot on the crowd. That is completely wrong and completely insane, but I think in the heat of that moment it felt like a liberating concept. And so I think it's also a matter of how not only the work of the mentally ill, but artworks in general are used or misused to open other territories of being, I think. And so I'm not saying that that's what the Biennale tried to do, but in a certain extent, yes, it was a way to look elsewhere, to say there is also this. And I think this goes back to the issue of the encyclopedia and the taxonomy. As I said before, it's not a show about the encyclopedia, and it's not a show in which I want to even things out. You know, I was reading actually Lynne's great text in, what is it called, the catalogue? Great and Mighty Things, which is a great essay about the assimilation and use of the outsider art by the mainstream. And actually, I think in your conclusion, I don't remember who you're quoting, but I think it's not a matter of inclusion, it's not a matter of putting things on the same field, but it's a matter of how these different objects can still have a disruptive quality, which I think goes back to your idea of a disruption of the symbolic order. You know, for me, all these objects together, both the ones by the professional artist and the ones by the amateur, are first of all representation of the world, and each one of them, I think it's worth observing and studying and getting to know. And on the other hand, I think they resist an assimilation into the encyclopedia. I was thinking, let's make a show of an encyclopedia of exceptions and not of rules fitting together. And so I don't know if that answers it. And the other last thing I want to say, that, you know, outsider is a complicated term, which I've also used. I thought as I was working on the show more and more, that there are more interesting terms like self-taught or dilettante or amateur, which express something that is closer to what I'm curious about. Both the artist is an amateur and needs to teach himself or herself how to use matter in a different way, and it's often as cheesy and romantic as it sounds, it's a labor of love, whether they get paid or not, when they're good artists. When they're making it just for the pay, then I think it's a problem.
I'd really like to give the idea of romanticism here, which Massimiliano has sort of tenderly touched, if not fully embraced, you know, back to Hal and Lynne. It feels kind of right about the show in certain ways, and Massimiliano has said better, well-informed and shameless romantic than an excessively learned cynic. Does that feel?
But that's not. No, I wasn't talking about this. I was talking.
No.
I was talking. No. It was. You can't be excessively learned, also, by the way. It's impossible, and that's the theme of the show.
Says, right?
But it's no. I mean, cynic, and it wasn't. It's referring to what I see happening to art also in the field that I occupy, which is. Looking at art for its price, looking at art as a status symbol, looking at art as decoration on the walls, and visual entertainment. And that, I spoke too much, I will shut up. But that goes back also to what you were saying, quoting me about being possessed by images. I think we are. I mean, we are choked by trash images all around us. And we go on the subway, like on TV and so on, we are submerged by images that are cheap, disgusting, ugly. And the question is, shouldn't we learn to be possessed by better images? And the medium that I'm evoking is not Lesage, even though those are all examples of medionistic painters, but I was trying to suggest that maybe there isn't so much difference between Lesage being possessed by images coming from the sky and Ryan Trecarten's character being possessed by images coming from YouTube. Like, I was trying to say that the first medium is the body, and we have to come to terms with that if we don't want to be poisoned by terrible images. That's the other more romantic position on the show.
Lynne, on the romantic character of the show.
I guess my question is, where does the romantic bleed into the curator as author? And you say in one of the texts, if I'm not misquoting you, that you wanted to get away from this trend in recent years where the curator's role is to present an authorial voice. But with the kind of openness and that I hear you talking about in terms of a romantic viewpoint, and I have some sympathies with that, I'm also unclear where we don't end up with a picture of the curatorial kind of picture of the world through the subjectivity of its maker.
Let's get Hal also on romanticism of the show.
That's for him. Yeah. I mean,
You sure?
I'll dive back.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll be quick because it is a position I'm also nervous about. And I mean, if the curator has a point of view, hallelujah. You know, I see so many biennals in which there are no points of views, and they're like stuff in room after room, and so I hope to make shows that have points of views. I say as a joke that curating starts at 2, but I think it's a responsibility of curator to put 2 different objects in a room. Every biennial or many biennials I've seen is 1 artist per room, make it big. So it's not a matter of authorship, it's a matter of, I think, perspective. And the more noise there is out there, I think the more we need places where there is perspective and where objects can be brought together in a symphony rather than just in a cacophony. But it's not, I'm not the author, I'm like a listener that juxtaposes sounds that I hope all together help each other to be themselves. I don't know if, I think it's a service, so it's not an authorship. It's a service to the artworks, and of course sometimes you can make them sound wrong. And you can misinterpret them, but so that's my position about it. But that doesn't mean I'm against a strong choreography or a strong perspective. That I'm very much in favor.
Hal, on romanticism.
Well,
of the
may I
show.
go just somewhere else?
Sure.
I mean, it seems to me that we have 2 ideas of the even field here. I mean, one is anthropological, which you articulated in the show. But then it seemed to me that your sense of the field was that all this work should move towards the category of art. I mean, and in just your remarks, Massimiliano, I felt a tension between your desire to move the exhibition away from art as understood by the market, and I think we all want to celebrate you for that desire. But then you turned around just a minute ago to say that we feel overwhelmed by images. So on the one hand, you want to move away from the art term as identified with the market or identified with an elite towards an anthropological understanding of images. But then you pull back from this cultural studies and say, oh, we need better images, better objects. And I'm actually with you there, because this old tension between art and anthropology is deep in my discipline. I mean, people often think that they're opposed. In fact, in the history of the discipline, they were completely coeval. And so the old argument, art history versus visual culture, never really meant much to me. But I think what happens when we pursue an even field, understood either as anthropological or artistic, is that we begin to lose dare I say it, the semi-autonomy, the semi-autonomous agency of the artist and of the work of art, its reflexivity, its expertise, its ability to call out to the past and call out to the present of art as well. That's where I don't run with you when you say, yes, we need an anthropological approach.
I feel it's like an auto-da-fe, it's a confession. Besides being romantic, I'm also conflicted. And that's what the question of the exhibition, should we do away with the definition of art? And on the other hand, as I say at the beginning, I believe that we need to reinvest some visual expression with not a sentimentality, but with a purpose that it's bigger than just being pretty pictures. And
I mean, I would argue that this is, in some sense, if you'll forgive me, this is the romanticism.
Yeah.
I mean, the term, one of the major languages for talking about that investment of his.
So to answer, I mean, to go back to your question, what I thought the show does, and I don't even, I don't want to give a wrong impression that I sat down for 5 months and, worked out the show and then say this is what the show is going to do. And it's also a much more both complicated and instinctual operation. But what I thought the show was doing was, on one hand, by bringing all these different objects on an even field and let's say on a field of anthropology, was getting rid of some attitudes that I see attached to artworks in the mainstream. And also you mentioned the elite. The market is not the elite. The market
I meant that there's two different ideas of the art,
yeah.
Of the art term.
To me, the problem is how the market has become the thing that the mass talks about.
Sure.
You know, that's the biggest problem. So on one
I
hand,
wonder if we can focus on the costs to this even field. I mean, that's your question then. And I think that should be
I would
put on the table.
Going back a little to what Massimiliano was saying, I don't think that we're deciding whether something's art or not. I think by the time, once you put it in the museum or once you put it in the Biennale, you're framing it in a certain way. And I think, as Svetlana Alba says in an essay, the museum effect comes into play. We start to look at it in certain kinds of predetermined ways. And it's that frame, and there are many different kinds of museums, but there is a set of frames that come with it. And that we're already in some arena that has to do with art and aesthetics. So for me, the question isn't making a decision beforehand, it's what happens once it's done.
yeah, well,
If that makes sense.
yeah, I also, going back to the general question, there is something I think it's important stating, that it's not Massimiliano who wakes up one day and says, outsider art is allowed inside the Biennale. I also wanted the show to reflect what I see, a preoccupation from many parts of our field, where there seems to be an interest and an attraction to whatever is defined as self-taught art. So I also wanted to make a show in which this tension was finally accepted and made visible without the sectorial division between the outside and the inside. And as I was saying before, the idea was also by creating this even field, on one hand to get rid of some of the myths of contemporary art, and on the other, and that is the problem of the romantic also, is to, and maybe the more conservative position, is to then suggest that all these objects are exceptional in some way. Not only exceptions, but they are exceptional, and maybe that's also the sort of heroism that you have problems with, and I'm also confused about, because I don't believe in the kitsch idea that the outsider artist is going to save us. I don't believe, which is also very common nowadays. You know, I don't think that's a legitimate position. But I do also believe in the exceptionality of some of those objects. So on one hand there is a flattening and, let's say, an anthropological approach. On the other, I do believe those images are better than others, and that's why they are in my Encyclopedic Palace, because I think they deserve to be looked at and loved more than the trash images that we see out there.
So we'll take maybe one more minute before we open the floor, and I wanted to come back to Hal's underlining of, I think, the question with which Lynne left us, which is what is both gained and lost as we allow a kind of convergence of categories that could otherwise be treated as distinct. And I think that could serve as a segue toward the question of history and historicity. In your opening remarks, Massimiliano, you said that you were really interested in this show in opening the temporal aperture of the biennial. And yet one of the interesting points that I think Lynne makes in the piece in art form, she pointed to it again here, is that one of the effects of this juxtaposition and the effective flattening that occurs in the logic of encyclopedism is an actual historicity. A historicism is lost, meaning we're no longer contextualizing individual objects with respect to their specific historical trajectories and the cultures out of which they come. So there's something kind of interesting about that. On the one hand, that the temporal aperture of the show has been opened, and yet, and I think this is exactly right, an actual commitment to something like history proper is actually more or less traduced in that very move. On that,
Well, think it is, because I think the choices of these mavericks, they're choices made of individuals who by definition don't fit. That seems to be the dynamic for what's being looked at. The shaker drawings within the shaker community are also very rare and odd. It's one moment in a long history of shaker lifestyle that this was allowed, that people actually made things that they owned and could give. And I think this taking of the weird and wonderful turns them into potential objects in the Wunderkammer. At the same time, we lose any ability to read them in any other way except as marvelous, but ineffably marvelous. And it's this ineffable marvelousness that bothers me.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is really important, and this is my take. I think this move away from context is very strong in the discipline of art history, and it might be active in contemporary art too. 25, 30 years ago, that turn to history, to social history, was a counter to a dominant iconographic model, a dominant formalist model. But that's now become dominant in turn. And I think the show is a very good example of an embrace of the, not the ahistorical, but the anachronic. I think this is a term that you have used, and it's become a buzzword in art history too. I don't mean simply a buzzword, but there's a desire to think about temporality in a different way, and not be under the conscience of meaning is context, context is meaning. And I think that might be true in contemporary art too, a certain dissatisfaction that somehow sight or discourse specificity is all, for all time. But there's another dimension there. I think somewhere in the catalogue, Massimiliano, or even tonight too, we've talked about the intensity of this work. And we talked about sentiment, feeling. And I think that this exhibition is also to be seen in the world of affect, real concern with the affective dimension that the grim Politburo at October wanted to get rid of once and for all, and many other people who should be gulag. But I also see this in the cabinet project. You seem to want the encyclopedia with feeling. You want rationality with the irrational part. And if we're all symptoms, I wonder if we could reflect not simply on the exhibition, but also the catalog as a cabinet production in these terms, an interest in the anachronic and an interest in the affective. Does that make any sense?
I think that would be a great way to begin to move to the floor, and to begin to move to the floor obliquely. To say something like, we sometimes give as one of the foundational moments of the magazine that showdown between Breton and Caillois over a set of Mexican jumping beans. This story may be known to many of you. A set of Mexican jumping beans found their way into Breton's circle, and they were a subject of much fascination, some whiny evening, and Caillois proposed an explanation for their behavior. There's got to be some kind of little worm or bug or larva in there that's kind of like maybe, and so what we should do is split one open and see what's going on. And I have this story. I should say that I really am ventriloquizing Sina here. Breton notoriously says, my God, what are you doing here, you paragon of the crushing logic of savage, scalpel-wielding, Occidental rationality. Did you miss the vote? Out with you. I'm not giving you one of the jumping beans to cut open. Kaiwa leaves in a huff. It's a classic kind of Parisian showdown over what you thought might be a bauble, but in fact comes to represent the veritable nexus of a set of crucial political, ethical, and intellectual hot issues. Kaiwa writes an angry letter that night in which he breaks with Breton's community, basically saying, if your vision of what makes kind of life meaningful is such that you're afraid of actual inquiry and that kind of opening things up and looking, then it's weak and defensive. I don't think actually we would have driven the magic, the mystery, the soul from the jumping bean by cutting it open. Every move of that inquiry that pursues knowledge, and here this is in some sense my gloss, creates a new set of occasions for the kind of remystification of the world. Every cut is an occasion for a multiplication, a kind of a meiotic splitting of the occasions for this form of trembling with meaning and potential and spirit, if you're a romantic. So I do think that moment, which again, somewhat in the style of anticipatory plagiarism, Cabinet will sometimes offer as one of the moments that the magazine was founded, does represent that appetite not to be afraid of what reason can do, to reject the notion that what it does is drive out spirit. It rather simply causes the occasions for the manifestation of spirit such as it is to proliferate. Is that okay, Sina?
Sounds great.
There we go. Shall we? To the room?
I'm going to pass the mic.
Let's go here and then to Celeste.
Can I just do
Can we bring down
the Amber Alert?
Can we bring down that guy?
Maybe I can just speak loudly, is that enough?
No, go ahead, because we're recording, so
So
better.
if you can bring down that, yeah,
Go ahead.
that's ready.
To the dialogue on historicity and the encyclopedic, I just wanted to bring back into focus a word that Massimiliano had used in his when he spoke, which was the use of the word synchronicity and the importance of synchronicity and how he saw his exhibition, and that synchronicity is another way of looking at time. And I'm a Jungian analyst, and that's why I came to see this. And I was very struck by the pairing of both, historicity and synchronicity as sort of left brain and right brain experiences of time, and then the encyclopedic as what Jung would call directed thinking, and the feeling as intuitive thinking, and just those pairings. And it may be a romantic vision, but I also think it's interesting when one sees where this has been taken with the whole study of the left brain and the right brain, so that I do see the presence of both of those in what he's presenting.
Wonderful. Wonderful. I'm going to do something we do sometimes here. You all have been patient, you've listened. Let's kind of gather from the room. So we're not going to respond ad seriatim to these questions. Let's get a bunch of stuff on the table, and then we'll come back up here to the panel. And then Celeste.
I wondered if you could address the relationship between the quest for total knowledge and the quest for total ignorance, in the sense that, thinking about Judith Scott's work, and while it's true that the idea of cutting the jumping bean, sort of that relentless will to inquire, is critical to the whole methodology of Cabinet and to the encyclopedic urge, is what's desired a kind of orgasmic point at which knowledge becomes impossible? And in that way, could you say that high and low culture have a similar interest of looking for the unknown? Is it why amateur sites on the internet of all variety have the appeal that they do? And are we looking in that way ultimately not to know?
Celeste.
Well, not having seen the Biennale, but having looked at the images that were presented here, it seemed very interesting, but it became very troublesome to then hear you categorize good and bad images after you were presenting an array that seemed to be much more inclusive than such categories. So I was thinking, and also because of the use of Wunderkammern and encyclopedia kind of interchangeably when they're so extraordinarily different, as the Wunderkammern privileged the extraordinary, whereas the encyclopedia tried to categorize it and lose its exceptional quality by the category itself, which is exactly what happens, by the way, with the Wunderkammern as they evolve in time. Slowly, with the Enlightenment, they begin to become rationalized, and then they lose their wonder. They begin to become understood. But I was trying to understand where this, where your own distinction between good and bad images might come from, considering that you said that this is an exposition that wanted to, you presented it as a reaction to this world of images that we are surrounded with. And in trying to organize it, you're trying to establish a difference between the outside and the inside, and to bring that outside in a very selective way. And I think that what is very interesting for me there is a notion that I think is underlying this encyclopedic compulsiveness, or this compulsion in which you try to rearrange our world of images and make a distinction between good and bad. This is, for me, is the catch: the good and the bad, the right and the wrong. And I wonder if it's not because there's a romantic underlying notion that has not been spoken about here, but that has a lot to do with what Professor Foster was talking about, and it's the notion of originality. Because I think that underlying this selection, as I have seen it here, is, and especially with the notion of the outsider, is this 20th century notion of originality that is still active, but in a different way that it was in the 20th century. After all, we're in the 21st, and we're reviewing very brutally all that was the 20th century. Brutally and interestingly also, because the 20th century was in its desire to put things in place, it was very radical and very brutal. So I would like to see if we could discuss, or you could discuss at some point, the notion where you see this notion of originality might be coming in place here. Because for me, when we speak of 20th century art, I think it was doomed by this notion of the genius, and the genius that whose contribution, and this is where the connection with the outsider is done through something that is extraordinary. So I see all these different connections.
Let's take two more, if we could, from the floor, if that would be okay, and then we'll come back a bit.
I was very struck by this sort of the drives that Prinzhorn enumerates, and the fact that what's missing from the art of the insane in Hal Foster's talk is sort of this desire to communicate, this desire to be part of a larger conversation. And I thought that was perhaps an interesting way of thinking about the Encyclopedic Palace. For me, when I walked through it, was this idea that all these different objects were actually brought into conversation, and I couldn't decide whether this was an incredibly generous act or an incredibly violent act. Because, of course, forcing the mute to speak can be seen both as good and bad. So that was something I wanted to think about, was this idea of the palace as a sort of locus for conversation.
And one more, thank you.
I think we can take one more question.
Let's take it.
It's like a show. It's about Rumi and
This is more just to introduce a term that I think, to me, comes up as a kind of elephant in the room in the conversation, and builds on your excellent question, which is just to introduce the category of the sacred into this conversation. And the sacred is something that is both impersonal or transpersonal, and that has as an experience a moment of non-being, but that's also very much rooted in the idea of the exceptional individual, and the individual who has access to a kind of power that others don't. And it just, this idea of the sacred, and also all the echoes of that Hal touches on, of the desire to, in modernism, to sacralize and re-sacralize art, just kind of echo for me. And so I'm curious if we could add that term to the other terms that we're talking about, like anthropology and romanticism, etc., because the sacred really seems to be in the room, in that tension.
That's wonderful. So here's how I propose we proceed. If in the course of hearing that there are specific things you know you want to say, that's great. There'll be a little time at the end where each of you will have a chance to kind of round out. But I think it's best we take kind of a couple of those and then really try to have a bit of collective conversation on them. So I'd ask that we start maybe with the idea of ignorance, George Prochnik's question. Some of you know, Londa Schibinger's work on agnotology, the history of forgetting and ignorance. So it does stand in a very interesting relationship to these ideas of totalizing, both the encyclopedism, and then Celeste helpfully distinguishes encyclopedism from the Wunderkammer, and we should talk about that too. But let's start there with agnotology and ignorance. Ignorance. Beautiful. So you will exemplify for us.
I think this is actually a question for you guys, a cabinet. There is a wonderful text in the book about the relationship between the drive for knowledge, ignorance, and melancholia, and how, and it's quite interesting that the word encyclopedia is invented or not introduced in the same center in which Dürer makes this wonderful etching. That the desire to know is always married to the revelation of our ignorance, and in that continuous tension, maybe it's where depression and melancholia begins, and that is a thought that is very much interwoven in the exhibition, maybe connects to the idea of violence, to which we can go back later. I think I tried to make a show that was so empathic and to the objects, and that presented artists or individuals who were so empathic to the world that I don't feel there is violence there, but there is a whole discussion about the Wunderkammer and its link to colonialism, and so we could start a whole different discussion there. But I think, to me, that was the focus of the relationship between ignorance and knowledge as a form of melancholia, and of discovering and being reminded every day that you never know everything, and of your ignorance, and how that starts over and over again.
You want that?
Yeah, I'm just very briefly. I think, Graham, you told me that the texts in the catalogue were commissioned to reflect on forms of the encyclopedia, like the encyclopedia per se, the archive, the museum, that they were asked to reflect on the exception or the anomaly that threatened whatever system was at issue. And I think this goes to your question, George, about a desire in a system to find where the system breaks down and where ignorance, if you like, rises up. That, not to tarnish the project, but that to me is an old impulse to, it's to resist the old, Hegelian model again with that node, whether it's, what do you want to call it? Base materialism, the apparatic moment in deconstruction, the thing that cannot be assimilated into knowledge. And that's just all to say that I do see your project in that line, and that's where I think I'm not sympathetic with it. Interesting. Anyway, interesting.
So,
because it's old, or?
No, I'm all for old. I mean, I have no choice.
because it's romantic, that there's a kernel that is remains fugitive and evasive, and
Because it's romantic.
Because it's romantic. That's the problem. Yeah. So Lynn, on ignorance and how it might fit with the ambition to totalize, a thought, and if yes, and if not, then we should go right to the sacred. It seems to me, because this is a perfect segue.
You can, yes,
do
exactly.
that.
You can
Okay.
make that segue between ignorance, what's not known, or the impossibility of knowing, but the unknowable, which is certainly aspects of the sacred as unknowable, and they're different, but there's some mirroring that's going on at the same time, I think. And within the romantic, there's a desire for some residue that can never be known. But I think that's a very different desire from the kinds of things that aren't known, but one can build structures around, discursive structures around to unpack in different kinds of ways. And so it's well, maybe that's enough.
No, I have a question which, in a way, is a question to myself and to Lynne and Hal, because it's something I've been asking myself a lot since the reviews have come out, and it connects also to the question about Jung and the sacred. My question is, as a curator, can you show objects without being assumed that you endorse the point of view of the author? The historian that writes about the Holocaust is not in favor of the Holocaust. The curator who displays Jung is a Jungian, and or he believes in the sacred, or I become, like I was joking that I was expecting a known critic to call me a crypto-fascist, which was the insult between again Bataille and Breton. They spend their life calling each other crypto-fascists. But I think it's an interesting question: is can you show objects as examples of attitudes toward the world without necessarily embracing them? And it's a very dangerous question because, could I show also things that are ideologically incorrect? And that maybe connects to the good and bad. And it's really a question, I don't know how you see that. For me, it was very liberating when I started looking at shows like curated by Mike Kelly or Gober or the poor Harald Zeman, which we always drag out of his coffin. It was to understand at one point that you could show objects without worrying about the good or bad. You could show objects because they were incarnation of a Weltanschauung, as they used to say, and that was quite liberating. And I think my shows got better that way. I'm not saying that I make shows of terrible art or terrible artists, but it became then the show a place where you observe objects that incarnate visions, and I don't necessarily embrace all those visions. I'm not Jungian. I would have been too many things in this show to be even coherent. And to me that's a big question. I don't know how you. On many levels, it's the difference between a curator and an artist. And I think when we did the great show with Rosemary Chalker, Cosmos, that I was biting my nails when you were making it because I was thinking of the show. What is the step that the artist can take or we cannot take, or is it okay that we take it? And maybe it has to do with violence. I think it has to do with hospitality more than violence, but that's a different story.
I would just say that I think when you bring in objects that are problematic for ideological and many other reasons, then you see a narrative. When it works, it seems to me there's a very tight narrative, which is not necessarily a thesis, but a narrative nonetheless, which is being woven around the objects. In the Gober show, the Menil, which had many objects that talked about black culture and a whole range of issues. It was possible to bring objects of such diverse kinds and sometimes such problematic sorts together because the narrative was, without being literal, was nonetheless clear. The conjunction and the segues and the relationships that were set up by those objects set value judgments in place. But I think that that's different from what an artist is often invited to do, which is something like Raid the Icebox, go into the basement and bring out as many odd forgotten things as possible and put them in as new and unprecedented relationships. And that's a different kind of thing altogether. And maybe also very tired of.
So, I mean, I think there's a way in which that question, interesting as it is, and it's an interesting answer, in relation to the question about the sacred, it could be understood to some extent as a kind of evasion. I mean, that is to say, you and I spoke a little bit about one of the visitors to the show who approached you with great enthusiasm saying, there is so much God in this show. And, you know, your kind of, oh, great, kind of response. And I think one reading of your question here is, well, my God, the guy thinks there's God in the show because I, you know, have some works in here that allude to the gods or have religious imagery in them, so kind of what a flat-footed, first-order kind of confusion about what this show is. And yet, to stay with the question about the sacred, it's the case that the first great makers of encyclopedic collections, I'm thinking of someone like Linnaeus, actually had as a central vision the idea that a cabinet of curiosities, a cabinet properly arranged, was like looking into the mind of God. It was like looking into the way that God would have ordered things before the fall. So there's a pretty close link between the kind of ambition toward encyclopedism and universalizing collations and a kind of aspiration in the direction of the divine, on the one hand, and that's a deeper sort of, I feel the gods in this show. And then we've come back and come back and come back again to the different forms of romanticism that I think can be understood to percolate through, if not permeate, the show. And romanticism is a kind of dilapidation of a theological project. It's a straightforward Comtean fall from the theological to the metaphysical. So, should we do a moment on the sacred under either of those aspects, rather than kind of just the idea of there being images in the thing that have a kind of an anthropological relationship to religion as narrowly construed by social scientists over the last 150 years or something?
It's late, man.
Not 10 more minutes, folks.
I don't do sacred.
You can always pass, Hal.
No, I mean, what you just said about, you know, here is through Linnaeus the mind of God disclosed in nature and vice versa. I mean, Levi-Strauss would say the same thing, but he would just say the mind of man. And maybe that's the humanism within structuralism. But I don't think
that's the positivist.
I don't know why you need to go to the sacred to have that sense of total knowledge. I mean, I don't. What did the person need? I mean, this is the difference between you and me. A person comes up and says to me, like, don't talk about schizophrenics. The person comes up to you and says, oh, it's fabulous you talk about God. How do you respond to that?
I didn't really respond, it was at the open. But it made me think of, going back to what I was trying to say, can I show objects without endorsing necessarily the point of view, but by respecting the point of view? We keep going back to the humanistic aspect. I think if there is a humanistic aspect in the show, is this idea of an equality of visions of the world that should all be preserved and respected. And of course, I'm also nervous about it, because would I respect the vision of the world of Goebbels? No. But that is the humanistic element in the show. The idea of the spiritual and the sacred, which of course is a great component of the show, for me was, first of all, well, there were many reasons for its inclusion. One is the fact that, particularly when it comes to early 20th century abstraction, people who thought they were painting God are not accepted in the canon. And I find it very interesting in relation to Kandinsky and the spiritual in art, that we still need the myth of the autonomy of the artwork to think that it deserves a space in art history. And of course by now also Makunzi is a part of art history, Clint is part of that, Lesage is part maybe less of a canonical art history, but to me the big question mark was if an artwork was made, or if an object was made with a purpose, even though this purpose was spiritual, we cannot look at it as an artwork, and it's not allowed to be in the canon. And so that was the big, more than talking about God, it was why the purpose is, decreasing the quality of this object. And second, what I said before, it was this idea, which is the big thesis of the show, that what is the status of the image today, and what is the location of the image in our body and outside of us. And so all those examples of mediumistic practice and so on, or even Jung, were there not because I'm Jungian and possessed and voodoo and so on, but because they express or exemplify different ways to carry the image in our body and outside of us. And some of them happen to be sacred. Of course, I'm Italian, so I'm romantic and probably involuntarily religious somehow. And it's also, shut up. The question of the possession and the healing of the image that Hal at the beginning was also rightly criticizing is for me crucial, is why do we accept the image to be polluting our view, but we find it ridiculous that other people thought that images could heal. I wish today we believe more in healing images than in spam emails, to put it simplistically.
What do you think? We should probably wrap.
5-10 minutes max.
5-10 minutes max. So, because I promised our panelists a chance to say a few final thoughts if they had them. That you can give your time back to the floor, and that would be beautiful if you wished. But otherwise,
I would be happy to do that.
She cedes her time to the floor. Huh? Yeah.
No, it would be mean if I don't now. So.
That was it. I'll put my notes aside. Let's take one or
pull everything together.
Let's take one or two more, and those two more from the floor.
For Professor, I was just wondering if you would all consider the idea of like the first printed materials of the Old Testament and the New Testament, and this idea of the sacred. They were encyclopedias of stories and laws of collections. And so maybe, I mean, I think it goes in with like the unknown or the ignorance and knowing. Could that be considered, especially Professor Foster, because I find your position very interesting and intriguing, and the conflict between the three, not the conflict, the conflict and the questions that they raise, a good conflict.
Wonderful, thank you. Maybe we do one more.
Yeah, hi there. I'm just wondering if the dichotomy between the sane artist and the non-sane artist is entirely useful. It seems to me that the point of much artistic production is the desire to create a sense of order or system.
Great. So, I take the first question in part to be raising the question of scripture and text. And we haven't taken time to think about how text relates to image. You've spoken quite powerfully about images as baggage, images as tools, the status of the image now and its power to heal. And yet there's quite a lot of text in the show. And that might be a kind of place for us to round out for a moment.
I'll start, this relates to the question. I think the title of the show, which reveals I'm a complete moron, is a bit misleading because he evokes the idea of the encyclopedic, but there is nothing, as I say from the beginning, that is related to the encyclopedia in the show. And on many levels, I thought, as I try to say many times in the book, that this is an exhibition about adventures of knowledge, more or less successful, actually many of them unsuccessful. So at the same time, it's basically an exhibition of storytelling, and so yes, text play a very important part in unraveling the stories and also creating other stories by departing from the images, and so I thought, again, this was something of a small liberating experience I had looking at somebody else's show, who is Roger Bruegel, who curated the documentary in 2001, whose shows I literally like dislike and don't care about. But when I saw one of his first shows, they were very heavy with text, and what it did to me as a viewer, and the tone of the text was quite interesting, because it wasn't the voice of the institution that it's supposed to tell you the truth. It's not the MoMA label that tells you this is a masterpiece and appreciated as such. It was a much more complicated tone, and I think from then I started thinking also, what is the voice of the show? And I mean, I thank earlier Chris Wiley that has been working on many shows with me, and he's the actual voice and the actual writing in many of those stories. But the idea that the image of the object becomes a form of storytelling, and not as, for me as an author, but also as a way to turn the show into a narrative or a sort of pedagogical machine, is for me very interesting. And I think, maybe because I'm Italian again, I'm used to think of images as containers of stories. Maybe because I've grown up in a Catholic environment, I would see a painting and see a story, and I see artworks and I see stories more than static objects that I need to contemplate for their presumed purity. So that's... and as a Catholic, I had to do a lot of voluntary work with schizophrenic patients.
We got it all. The sacred.
Yeah, just move on to my side.
Yeah, one from the north. Radically Protestant. I know the Bible only through art and movies. Literally. But so I can't. Do you want to speak to the Bible question?
No, all to a different text, actually. I would say that one of the things I like, that I found absolutely crucial to the exhibition, was the role of the labels. That, and for those of you who haven't seen the show yet, there was a very standardized text which had like the first paragraph about the artist, place, form, so date, then a paragraph about the practice, and then a paragraph about the specific work on view. And it was the same all the way through, and they were extraordinarily, they were great. They were well written, they said things, and without that, I think I would have been much more at sea. And there were no large framing didactics. And I think that the balance you struck by having text relating to specific bodies of work, that many of which were completely unfamiliar to me, was an amazingly useful and terrific tool.
To the team.
Yes, so text.
I just wanted to say one thing about the question of the sane and the insane. The project of the modernists that I mentioned tonight was to undo in different ways this distinction, whether it was Prinzhorn or Klee or Dubuffet. And they found it difficult in the end to do so. Art brew was really developed as a term to undo the opposition, but it didn't work. And all I am here to say, I mean, it's fine to think about art in terms of visions. I think we often do. But I think we have to differentiate between, among, the kinds of visions. And that's what I wanted to do as I thought specifically about the art of the insane. It's a different order of vision. It's not to say it's lesser or higher or greater. It's different. And if we use the visionary, use the sacred as a way to conflate these things, I don't think that that's a good idea. And I also wonder about this idea of the healing. I think this is another problem I have with contemporary life, which is the way in which we believe that, we're asked to believe that images of objects are agents. I just, again, maybe it's North, South, Protestant, Catholic. I mean, we could spin this out in many different ways, but for me, we are the agents. And we project onto images and objects, as we make them, as we receive them, human agency. We should never forget that that's what we do.
I'll just add two things. One, about the sane-insane distinction, that I think also what is emerging about the show is maybe a wrong perspective on the show, because I was, maybe not successfully so, but I was very careful to make sure that the dilettante or the amateur in the show were not just the insane or just the schizophrenic or the hospitalized. And that was also the importance of having Auriti opening the space in the Arsenale and Jung opening the space in the Central Pavilion. Jung is not crazy, or maybe he was having a bad time. No, but Jung is certainly not a patient in that moment, and he's a dilettante, he's an amateur, and that's, again, I want to insist on that term. The interesting thing that I was thinking before, no matter if it's self-taught or artists, professionals, so on, we always describe what they do as work, which maybe that's also problematic. Not that it's an expectation about the artwork that it's very determined. So anyway, I just wanted to specify that it's not a show about the sane and the insane, but very different gradation of inclusion and exclusion that hopefully also disturb the clarity of the distinction between the sane and insane. And the whole question, which I've been asked why there aren't political artists in the show, why isn't a show about the recession? I think the question at the heart of the show is who is in and who is out, and who has the right to say that you're in and out. And besides the question on the images, that to me is a crucial question. And about agency, I agree with Hal, but there is a great quote that, because I'm a romantic, I love, by Giambattista Alberti, who says that images are the children of nostalgia because they act as friendship, they make the absent present. And that, I think, it doesn't mean that the image is magic, but it means that by bringing that presence, he absolves to a function that I think it's deeply human, of feeling a lack for something that the image satisfies, and that is to me a little magic. I know that we make it, but I think the stupor we feel in front of it every time is quite special. I feel like a preacher at this point.
Well, no, I think we should leave. I think we should leave the question of the agency of the work in suspension as we close. It won't, needless to say, be possible to resume the conversation, although an etymology of the term encyclopedism takes us back actually to very much that idea of all around, and reminds us too of a final notion that hasn't come up explicitly, but I think has been implicit in our conversation tonight. The pedism of encyclopedia is the same pedes, etc., of paideia in Greek, a term for the learning that was necessary to collective life, the notion of the formation of citizens, members of a community, that almost sacred notion of education and the sharing of what we know that lies in the Greek term paideia. And encyclo is all around. So I do think that the panel this evening and what Massimiliano has done with his team in Venice, and also in some ways what Sina and Jeff and the cabinet makers in a small but very real way have tried to do here with cabinet and with this space, is indeed instantiate that notion of paideia with a very large circumference. So join me in thanking our panel.